I'm going to present some preliminary results from an experiment that I'm running in the Siberian tundra. And I'm really hoping to get lots of feedback and questions from you. So my name is Runa Magnusson. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at Wageningen University, which is a university in the Netherlands that's focused mostly on environment, agriculture, and food. And I work in the plant ecology and nature conservation group there. So all my colleagues are actually biologists and ecologists. And apart from my supervisor, I am the only one at this moment focusing on permafrost. So for me, it's very nice to have this opportunity to speak to a permafrost-oriented audience today. So to get started, for you, I don't think I need to be very elaborate on the introduction, because we all know about the permafrost carbon feedback, and we all know about the large uncertainties that are still involved with the potential added release of greenhouse gases from thawing permafrost. Because on the one hand, we still don't have a very good overview of the different ways in which permafrost will thaw across Arctic regions, because abrupt thaw will have a very different effect than a gradual deepening of active layers of permafrost, as abrupt thaw can lead to formation of ponds and polygonal tundra and slumps, and can have really huge consequences for local topography, hydrology, greenhouse gas emissions. But on the other hand, there is a pan-Arctic greening trend, especially for shrub vegetation, which suggests that there may be a sequestration also of carbon in living biomass. And this may offset a small part of these anticipated emissions from permafrost. So there are different factors at play, and it's important for us to understand exactly how much of each of these processes we can expect to make a good assessment of the anticipated release of greenhouse gases from thawing permafrost. But when we talk about global change and a changing climate, we usually think about temperature. But temperature is not the only thing that is changing across the Arctic, because precipitation patterns are also changing much more rapidly in the Arctic than in other regions around the world. And there are several reasons why this happens. Firstly, because warmer air can contain more water vapor, which can also lead to more precipitation. But there is also an increased horizontal transport of water vapor from lower latitudes. And due to the retreat of sea ice, there can be more evaporation of water over oceans, which can also lead to changes in local precipitation patterns. Overall, the current IPCC estimates anticipate a 50% increase in precipitation in the Arctic in general. And it's also interesting to realize that if the summer season, or the period with temperatures above zero, is going to be longer, then an increased amount of this precipitation will fall as rain instead of as snow. So this suggests that it could also be very important or worthwhile to quantify the effect of changes in precipitation patterns on permafrost thawing depth and stability. So that is what we do. And our particular focus is on the effect of extreme summer precipitation. And we study this in the Siberian lowland tundra at the Chokradagh Scientific Tundra Station. You can see that it's really far east, basically the same longitude as Japan, pretty far away. There are few study sites in this huge area in eastern Russia. And yeah, so many studies of permafrost focus on lakes and polygonal tundra, but we also see lots of micro-scale thermokarst collapses in this region. As you can see here, really tiny thaw ponds, likely because it's a very poorly drained lowland area overlying ice-rich permafrost with ice lenses that can melt when the permafrost active layer deepens. So I've gathered some satellite images here where you can see that these ponds can appear, and some of them are expanding, but we also see ponds that are decreasing in extent. So it's a very dynamic area. And we were also interested to see whether extreme precipitation events can trigger the formation of such small-scale permafrost collapses. And we got the expectation that this might be the case from a running experiment at the site, in which dwarf shrubs, Betula nana, were removed from experimental plots in 2007 to assess the interactions or the effect of shrub cover on permafrost. And yeah, I recommend you to have a look at these papers, because it was really amazing. On a rather short term, the permafrost did collapse under the plots where the shrubs were removed, or at least many of them, suggesting that shrubs can maybe also affect the surface energy balance and protect the permafrost underneath. So you can see that the active layer in the treatment plots, in the white bars, really increased a lot relative to the control plots in the gray bars. But for this presentation, I also want to have a look at what happened in these control plots, because these are undisturbed sites that have been monitored now for thawing depth for 13 years. So we have a 13-year record of annual thawing depth in July in this case. And we see that in particular 2011 had relatively high thawing depths, while this was not a particularly warm summer. So we were interested to see what could be an explanation here. So this is the work of a bachelor student who correlated the thawing depth in July against temperatures and found a pretty good relation with temperature, except for 2 years, the orange dots. And these years were very dry years. So when he correlated the thawing depth with precipitation, he got a much clearer correlation, indicating that it's not only warm summers in which you typically find deep thawing depths, that it could be that it's in particular warm and wet summers, and that if it's very warm but also dry, soils may have more insulating capacity, because wet soils are more conductive to heat. So this got us particularly interested in testing the effect of high levels of summer precipitation on thaw of permafrost. Yeah, here we see a precipitation, summer precipitation overview, and you can see that in this year 2011, in which we found high thawing depths, it was a very wet summer. So we set out to mimic this very wet summer by artificially supplying 100 millimeters of extra precipitation to experimental plots over the course of the month July in 2018. And we supplied this with a motor pump in 10 to 15 millimeter portions. And in these plots, we monitored thawing depth, microtopography using relative elevation with a leveler. We check for local water table on top of the permafrost and vegetation composition. So we started all this in 2018, and we have 2 summers of data now. And we were wondering whether we could see indications of these small-scale permafrost collapses starting to form in irrigated plots. And this is what we usually see in those small ponds, that there is a lowering of the elevation, and gradually you see that the shrub vegetation starts to show signs of stress, like small discolored leaves, and then eventually they're just dead shrubs standing in a pool. And these pools can in turn be colonized by other species, such as sedges and sphagnum peat mosses that like these wet conditions. But here, yeah, that's probably things occurring on a much longer time scale. So I'm going to be focusing for the results mostly on the thawing depth water tables and soil moisture. But first, the spatial design. We used motor pumps and local water because we don't have running water at our site or electricity. So we used fuel, motor pumps, and local water supplied to irrigated plots. And for each irrigated plots, we had a control plot that was checked for similar initial conditions, so similar vegetation composition, similar thawing depth, similar position in the landscape at 5 meters across. So the precipitation was supplied by sprinklers. Yeah, this is what it looked like. And I have a video here, but it has a pretty drony, noisy sound of the motor pump. So make sure your audio is not too loud. Here we go. And you can also see how many mosquitoes there are in Siberia. It's really amazing. We had a dog with us, helping us. So yeah, that's just to get an idea of what we were doing. And then in all of these plots, we had 9 measurement points for thaw depth that we just measure with a steel rod water table that we checked using PVC wells in the soil moisture with a sensor, and a couple of other things that might give us an indication of changes in permafrost and vegetation status. Composition, visual cover estimates of vegetation, vegetation height, and relative surface elevation. And we analyzed our data using linear mixed effects models to account for the nested setup with multiple measurements in one plot. So this is what we found. Active layer thickness, or I should say thaw depths actually. Thaw depths during the summer of the treatment. These are measurements before irrigation started. So we see that there are very similar conditions in the control and irrigated plots initially, but we see pretty pronounced increase in thawing depth of the irrigated plots in blue relative to the control in pink. And yeah, especially interesting when I went back last year and measured again in the beginning of the summer, or well, end of June, so early summer still. Seemed like there was no effect anymore, but still by the end of the season, as the summer progressed, the irrigated plots had developed statistically significantly deeper thawing depths. So in the year in which we irrigated, the irrigated plots increased 63% faster in thaw depth than in 2019, the year after, in which we didn't irrigate anymore. They still increased 44% faster. Very interesting. And I was really hoping to be able to go back this year and see if there's still a differential development, but it looks like we cannot go anymore. Really a pity. Then, usually in this shrub-dominated vegetation on which we installed the plots, you don't really see an internal water table on the permafrost, but over the course of this month in which we irrigated in 2018, you see that a lot of the irrigated plots developed a significant amount of standing water on top of the permafrost, whereas in 2019 this was not visible anymore. Control plots dried out over the course of the summer in 2018, whereas the irrigated plots remained wet. And yeah, I have to say 2019 was a very dry summer, or at least early summer in June was very, very dry. So here both irrigated plots and the control plots were very dry, and they remained very dry. Although it seemed that the irrigated plots were just slightly wetter. So this is the soil moisture in the topsoil, in the top 5 centimeters. So yeah, to summarize, in both years, the thawing depths had become significantly larger in irrigated plots. whereas they were not different in the beginning. And I thought that this development of an internal water table might be an interesting explanation here, because we see a pretty significant buildup of water tables at the end of the summer in 2018. And the standing water, of course, does get frozen later in the summer, which means that there might be some ice deeper in the soil in the summer after. So I was wondering, maybe that could explain why still the irrigated plots melted deeper in 2019, because there was some excess ice there deeper in the soil that had not really thawed yet at the beginning of the summer. And I wondered whether this could also provide some kind of explanation of why there was a slightly higher soil moisture in the topsoil at the beginning of the summer in 2019, especially since it was so dry everywhere. Could it be that there is somehow still a larger reserve of water in the soil that has been frozen over the previous winter and then gets released again the next summer? So these are the most evident changes, of course, and we have not observed any differences yet in vegetation composition, in vegetation height, and in microtopography in irrigated plots versus control plots. But it could, of course, very well be that these are simply things that occur on a larger time scale. So it's very interesting for us to keep monitoring here. But yeah, here we run into problems for the coming summer, because I would very much like to go back and see if there are still differences in abiotic conditions between the irrigated plots and the control plots, but it's very likely that we cannot go. And here I'm having a bit of a dilemma, and I'm very open to your feedback with respect to this dilemma. Should we start writing a manuscript based on these findings, knowing that we only have 2 summers of data and that it would have been possible, or at least interesting, to see what would happen in the year after? Or should we postpone and go back in 2021, risking that there is no significant difference anymore by then? Yeah, I don't know. So let me know what you think. Let me know what your questions or feedback is. And thank you so much for listening. Please get in touch with me if you'd like to. Thank you.